Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast where we talk about movies you never saw, scripts that were never filmed, and ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka.
And my name is Tony Goldmark.
That's right. We are not alone this week. We have a friend with us. If you are a listener to any of our other shows or a listener to the other Pipe Dream podcast show, Escape from Vault Disney, you know Tony very, very well. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah. I was talking to Tony on Facebook like a week or two ago, and he was like, hey, are you planning on talking about Roger Rabbit 2? And I had no idea that there was even a planned sequel to Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, neither did I.
Not only a planned sequel, but several planned sequels, which I'm sure we'll get into. Several plans that all eventually fell by the wayside. And yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind when I saw you had this podcast about unproduced projects. I also said, you're gonna do an episode on the Tim Burton, Kevin Smith, Nicolas Cage Superman movie, to which David said, we already recorded the first part, so...
Yep.
My answer is, we recorded part 1, and we're recording part 2 later today.
Because that's the other big no-brainer
of
just fascinating projects you love talking about. But anyway, we're talking about Roger Rabbit here.
Yes,
yeah,
we are.
For sure. Yeah, let's go ahead and just start us off, Dan. You want to start diving into it?
Sure. So I kind of want to start it off with the first Roger Rabbit. So Who Framed Roger Rabbit was released in theaters on June 22nd of 1988 and made a huge splash, not just in the box office when it made nearly $330 million, but it really pushed the boundaries of rotoscoping technology. The film was filled with iconic characters from both Disney, WB's Looney Tunes. There was even a shot where both Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse shared the same amount of screen time, even down to the frame.
Better let him have it, Bugs.
Okay, Doc. Whatever you say.
But it also introduced a whole cast of new unforgettable characters like Baby Herman, Benny the Cab, Roger Rabbit, and undoubtedly Jessica Rabbit. The film won 3 Academy Awards for Best Film Editing, Sound Effects Editing, and Best Visual Effects. So with all the success, a plan for a sequel felt inevitable.
And we should probably mention that one of those Oscars going to a previous subject of this podcast, Richard Williams.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. You know, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it's so iconic. I feel like if there's any listeners who haven't seen Who Framed Roger Rabbit, go see Who Framed Roger Rabbit right now. It's on Disney+. It's great. It's just an amazing movie. It still absolutely holds up as both a terrific story and an eye-popping technical marvel, especially considering the time it was made.
Yeah.
But it's also, for as much success as it had, it's also kind of a fascinating singular movie in Hollywood history in the sense that it was both a huge hit that was massively influential and a one-of-its-kind miracle movie that's paradoxically, in many ways, completely unlike any other film like it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I feel like there have been attempts since then to combine different properties together and explore the world. For some reason, the only thing that's coming to mind right now is Food Fight, which is absolutely the worst example of an attempt at a movie like this.
Well, it was influential on 3 different levels. It was influential on a technical level, it was influential on a story level, and it was influential on a let's just combine everything gimmick level, which the third of which, you mentioned Food Fight, but also Wreck-It Ralph definitely owes a lot to Roger Rabbit.
Oh, that's true.
And even Toy Story, I would say. Let's get all the toys, let's license Mr. Potato Head and Slinky and make them characters too. The idea of licensing all these characters from different areas. And as far as story goes, it's interesting how all the different elements of Roger Rabbit kind of inspired different kinds of movies. Like, in the last 5 years, I could name 4 different movies where the story is buddy cop flick with a fantasy element that's also a heavy-handed racism metaphor. Zootopia, Detective Pikachu, Happy Time Murders, and Bright.
Oh my gosh,
All four of those
yeah.
movies, it's just Roger Rabbit with animals, Roger Rabbit with Pokemon, Roger Rabbit with puppets, and Roger Rabbit with orcs, respectively. It's the same movie. I mean, if you want to count the 90s in this, Theodore Rex is just Roger Rabbit with a dinosaur.
I forgot about Theodore Rex.
I hadn't really thought about that being a trope of allegories for racism in a buddy cop fantasy world. But you're totally right.
You could even argue Men in Black counts.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
In some ways, that's just Roger Rabbit with aliens. But the real area where Roger Rabbit was massively influential was technically.
Yes.
Like, in terms of the sheer act of blending live-action characters with animated characters seamlessly, it really nailed down so many of the principles of how to make this kind of a movie. But the paradox of that is that it was also so notoriously expensive at the time and went so ridiculously over budget and was such a crushing financial risk to the studio. Now, a risk that ended up paying off, but a risk nonetheless, that very few films followed in its footsteps until the CGI revolution came along, and especially mocap, you know. Those tools made making this kind of movie much easier, because making Roger Rabbit, it was one of the hardest movies ever made up to that point, just because it was such a technical challenge, and we'll get into why, but like, nowadays, CGI and mocap characters are so commonplace in movies, you don't even really think about it anymore. Like, Thanos is technically an animated character, but you don't think of him that way. You think of him as a character first, but the technical process that's used now to bring characters like Thanos and Rocket Raccoon and even the Hulk to the big screen, they very much had their starts in Roger Rabbit.
And I think one of the other really impressive things about the technical achievement of Roger Rabbit is that it was a technical achievement that was still driven by an artist who had a very artistic vision. We spent 2 episodes talking about Richard Williams and The Thief and the Cobbler, and so there's so much of that that's still fresh in my mind. But I think part of the reason there was this really impressive tech in that movie worked so well is because you had some very visionary person who was directing it with an artistic eye. And I think, you know, that is one of the big stumbling points that we see in developments of technology in the 10 or 15 years following this movie is there was so many attempts at technical brilliance that lacked the artistic eye, and so it didn't work as well because there were a lot of people who were trying to just be technical for the sake of being technical, and it didn't mean anything.
And I might even add Robert Zemeckis, the director of this movie, to that list, because when he got into his mocap is love, mocap is life state in the mid-2000s, you know, with Polar Express and Beowulf and A Christmas Carol, I would argue at that point he was definitely just playing with his toys for the sake of playing with his toys. But in this case, this was a project that had been in development at Disney since the early 80s. In fact, if you search YouTube for Roger Rabbit 1983, there was even a TV segment on, I think, a Disney Channel TV show of the animators at the time talking about the Roger Rabbit project they had in development in 1983.
They all combined animated cartoon characters with live-action real people, which is not all that easy to do. But this bunch in here intends to use that technique as it's never been used before, to tell a full-length feature story. I love the title. Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
It looked like a very different film. The character designs were very different. You could tell it wasn't going to be quite as technically advanced in terms of moving the camera. And I guess Disney Channel was just really desperate for content in those first couple years, and that's why this piece of footage even exists. What Zemeckis and Richard Williams really brought to the project is that up to that point, with the occasional live-action animation hybrid movie like Mary Poppins or Bedknobs and Broomsticks or Pete's Dragon, Disney had very strict rules on how to make them. You had to bolt down the camera, you couldn't pan, you couldn't push in or out, you had to keep the shot perfectly stationary to make it easier for the animators to draw the dancing penguins later.
Was that like a contract with the animators that they were given all of this footage and they were like...
I think it might have been, and Zemeckis and then later Richard Williams, and this is, by the way, You got to realize Disney was developing this project because they had the animation department and they wanted to give them stuff to do in between the main features. That's kind of why the animated segments from, Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Pete's Dragon happen, is because, hey, we've got all these animators employed here. We got to give them something to do while Walt's making up his mind about what's the next full-length animated feature to be. And we've stopped doing shorts, so we can't do those anymore.
Well, what I find interesting is that the outside influences, because we know from Richard Williams that he did not like Disney, or he didn't want to be working for Disney as like a permanent animator for them. So
he had studied under Milt Kahl, who was one of Walt Disney's 9 old men, but he specifically hated the bureaucracy at Disney. He was extremely opposed to that. But that's a big part of the reason why, rather than rely on this stable of animators they already had, at Zemeckis's and eventually Spielberg's behest, they farmed it out to Richard Williams in London, because he kind of shared Zemeckis's attitude of, we should have the freedom to move the camera wherever we want. And Richard Williams said, yeah, I'll catch up to you. I'll be your pencil, basically.
Well, if you had ever seen The Thief and the Cobbler, and if you ever watch any of his animations, when you watch something like Raggedy Ann and Andy, you can definitely tell there is a lot of movement, not just in the characters or in the scenery, but there is movement in the camera as well. He wants you to believe through animation that you are living in a 3D world. And that is a lot of the appeal of Richard Williams, and his push in animation was giving the audience this feel as if they're not looking at just background characters in front. You're actually living in this world with them.
And that's why Richard Williams was hired, is because they had faith that he had the drive to be able to pull this off, both technically and also tonally, because at the same time, what they really wanted in this movie was Tex Avery style cartoon animated gags. They wanted that. Tonally, they wanted that style of humor in this movie. This was before Aladdin, before The Emperor's New Groove, before the Disney animators had really proven, no, we can do cartoony animation as well. Up to that point, they were all these CalArts students trained by the 9 old men, and they weren't sure they'd be able to pull off the Looney Tunes style manic cartoon energy after they'd all been working on The Fox and the Hound. It's just apples and oranges.
One thing about the production of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I think, is a myth that I had believed until you told me otherwise, Dan, and I'm sure we have listeners who may be thinking about this as well. Is there any truth to the idea that pieces of the script came from a unproduced Chinatown sequel?
It was definitely inspired by Chinatown, in the same way Aragon was inspired by Star Wars.
It's the same genre, and so it's going to borrow a lot of the same tropes, and at that point, Chinatown is one of the fundamental films of the genre, and so you're going to draw some inspiration from it.
I found the specific inspiration. It was the fictional Cloverleaf streetcar subplot from Chinatown that did inspire this.
It's Cloverleaf that wants to get their hands on Toontown. They put in the highest bid.
Now, there is a actual sequel to Chinatown, and that's called
The Two Jakes, I believe.
The Two Jakes, yes. That went through development hell for a little bit, but there was no talk of it being about a streetcar. Now, it makes sense that you're doing stories about corruption in California, more specifically Los Angeles. It would make sense to make that connection, but there is no actual story that, because of Roger Rabbit, they never made the sequel for Chinatown specifically.
I think that's one of those internet myths that's just kind of spread around because it makes sense, especially when you consider, one is about corruption in water rights and the other one is about corruption in transportation rights.
Well, it's this close to not being a myth because the screenwriters have admitted, yeah, we were straight up inspired by Chinatown here. And in fact, if you take out the tunes, what happens in the movie about getting rid of the streetcar and replacing them all with highways and bulldozing low-income housing and, putting a bunch of people out on the street, that happened. But in real life, the bad guys won.
Yeah, in real life, we didn't save Toontown. We paved over it to build Dodger Stadium.
We absolutely did, and the world is poorer for it. Getting back to the process, what's interesting to me about this movie technically is, like I said, when CGI and mocap came along, it really streamlined the process of how to make these kinds of movies. But until that happened, because Roger Rabbit had been so expensive, and this is also a big part of the reason why the sequels never happened, it was so expensive that no one really wanted to try to copycat. You could count the hand-drawn Roger Rabbit wannabes on one hand. Space Jam, Looney Tunes Back in Action, Cool World, and that's about it. I mean, maybe if you really squint, you could count The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, but even then, the animated characters were CGI made to look kind of hand-drawn. They weren't actually hand-drawn in that movie. So really, it's just those three. I mean, 2.5, because who the hell counts Cool World as a full movie? But
I've got news for you, pal. I am not your ordinary doodle.
I know we went all over the place there more than we usually do
sorry
for
about that.
your intro
It's
stuff.
fun.
Dan, no, that's good. Dan, go ahead and continue.
Going back to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, so the film is loosely based off of the Gary Wolfe book, Who Censored Roger Rabbit. In this, the characters are comic strip characters instead of cartoon characters. In the book, the detective Eddie Valiant, while on the case to solve Roger Rabbit's contract that were sold to some mystery person, he was trying to find out who those contracts were sold to, and in the midst of doing so, Roger Rabbit had been murdered. So now this turned from, I guess, the contract mystery over to a murder mystery because of that. And now he had to investigate 3 different suspects: Roger Rabbit's widow, Jessica Rabbit, Roger's former co-star, Baby Herman, and Roger's photographer, Carol Masters. Carol Masters did not make it into the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit, though. I, for a second, thought she was going to be the bartender that gives Eddie Valiant the camera, but they didn't color Carol Masters.
You got that camera of yours? Mine's in the shop.
Wouldn't be the pawn shop any chance, would it?
Oh, come on, Dolores.
I feel like that was a missed opportunity. I kind of wish that they did that instead. But then along the way, Valiant actually encounters Roger Rabbit's doppelganger, and with their buddy cop type relationship, they actually help solve the mystery.
That's kind of interesting, just to have a doppelganger of the murder victim.
Yeah.
it was a very, very different thing from what the movie ended up being. I mentioned that 1983 version of the movie earlier. Like, that's, like I said, very different from the movie as well. Like, originally, one of the big changes was that in the 83 version, Jessica was basically going to be the villain. And she was painted as, like, this conniving, seductress.
You have beautiful features, so strong and well-defined.
Chipped out of granite, that's me.
You will take my case, won't you?
Not a chance.
What do you mean, not a chance?
She was bad and drawn that way, basically.
I can see that easily. Her being, like, seductive, dressing in red. You kind of see her as, like, first the femme fatale and then as the backstabbing widow. But for her to be the femme fatale the entire time, I think makes that story much more interesting.
What they did in the actual movie of Roger Rabbit, I think, is such a great turn on that kind of character. The idea of, right off the bat, you assume this is going to be a femme fatale and this is somebody who is not on your side. And she turns out to be just as loving and dedicated as she said she was in the beginning. And it is a fun twist on the genre that you do have this character who isn't bad and just drawn that way.
No, I love my husband. You've got me all wrong. You don't know how hard it is being a woman looking the way I do.
So in 1981, Disney bought the rights for Who Censored Roger Rabbit shortly after it was published. Now, Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman were hired to write the script. They didn't really have much before then, but they would later on go on to write Tales from the Crypt, Wild Wild West. Sorry, this is a ridiculous film. We talked about it in Superman. How the Grinch Stole Christmas. That was the one with Jim Carrey in the year 2000. Last Holiday, Shrek the Third, and many more. Around 1982 is when Robert Zemeckis offered to direct the film, but because of his recent flops, I Want to Hold Your Hand and Used Cars, Disney declined to have him direct.
What else had he done at the time?
Those two, he directed I Want to Hold Your Hand and Used Cars, and he had co-written 1941, which of course was an infamous flop for Spielberg.
That's kind of crazy that he would even be considered before he had things like Back to the Future and the things that actually made him a name.
Well, he didn't even be considered. He just said, hey, I'm available to direct. Let me do it.
I mean, this is going off on a tangent, but, when he and his writing partner, Bob Gale, wrote the first draft of Back to the Future, no one in Hollywood wanted to buy it because, they hadn't made a hit. And Spielberg offered to attach himself to it in the hopes that that would entice studios more. And Zemeckis at first said, you executive produced both of my movies that I directed. I wrote your only flop. If your name is attached to this third film and it flops too, I'll never work again in Hollywood. People will only see me as Spielberg's friend who only rides his coattails. Now, fortunately, Zemeckis got the job of directing Romancing the Stone in 1984, and that was a big hit.
Oh, yeah.
And that allowed him to get Back to the Future made, and that's why he brought it back to Spielberg. He thought, well, it's only right I'd give this to the only guy who had faith in it to begin with.
Otherwise, he would have been the Ringo Starr of Amblin Entertainment.
Yep. I used to play bass for Ringo of Amblin. But anyway.
So yeah, they declined him, but while they were in pre-production development, they decided to do a screen test, like you were mentioned before, in 1983, with Daryl Van Critters as the animation director. Paul Rubens voiced Roger Rabbit.
Yes, sir. But wouldn't it be more helpful if I started to came along with you? Because what if maybe you gotta get into some more locks or something? Okay.
Peter Renaday did Eddie Valiant, and Russi Taylor was Jessica Rabbit.
The late, great Russi Taylor, who was also the voice of Minnie Mouse for many, many years, and Huey, Dewey, and Louie on the original DuckTales.
Wow.
Okay, I can see why they would choose her for that.
Yeah.
So then around 1985, that's where a lot of things change, not just with the production, but with Disney hiring the new CEO, Michael Eisner. I'm not sure if you have any input on like Eisner coming in or like why that change or switch happened.
Examining the corporate culture of Eisner's entrance into Disney, I think is crucially important for understanding why Roger Rabbit never got a sequel. Because basically in 1984, two big things happened at Disney. Number one was Eisner came aboard, but before Eisner came aboard, the movie Splash was released.
There is a mermaid in New York City.
How come she's got legs?
She has legs out of the water. She has fins in the water.
Splash was the first movie that Disney released under the Touchstone banner, and it was Disney's biggest hit in years. Like, following Walt Disney's death in 1966 and about 15 years of what would Walt have done-ism at the studio to increasingly diminishing returns, Eisner's predecessor, Ron Miller, spent the early 80s releasing a string of audacious experiments that he hoped would catch on and put Disney back on the map, and none of them did. And they all went against the Disney formula in some major way. Movies like The Watcher in the Woods, The Devil and Max Devlin, Tron was a big one. That, of course, became a cult hit, but it wasn't a big hit at the time. Something Wicked This Way Comes, and eventually the likes of Return to Oz and The Black Cauldron. And the only one of these experiments that was a big hit was Splash, which was the first time he said, what if we make a movie that's just not Disney at all? And it wasn't really made for kids, even though it had fantasy elements to it. It was very distinctly a romantic fantasy comedy for teens and adults, and it was a big hit. And for the first time in Ron Miller's tenure, one of his weird experiments actually caught on, but it was too little too late. Later that same year was the big regime change, when Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg from Paramount and Frank Wells from Warner Brothers took over the Mouse House. Now, in part because Splash had been Disney's biggest hit in years, it kind of pointed the way forward in many ways for Eisner and company. Like, it's easy to forget now because the legacy of the Disney Renaissance has so completely eclipsed everything that happened immediately before it. But for most of the 1980s, new Disney family films were the least successful part of the company. If you look at the box office returns for those first few years after Eisner took over, and, Disney's biggest hits were all released by Touchstone. Down and Out in Beverly Hills, Ruthless People, The Color of Money, Outrageous Fortune, Stakeout, and of course two massive mega hits at the end of 1987, the 1-2 punch of Three Men and a Baby and Good Morning Vietnam. All of those films were Touchstone pictures. About half of them were rated R. Some of them, like Ruthless People, are like a hard R. I know you talked about Ruthless People briefly on your Weird Alphabet podcast on Toothless People. I highly recommend Ruthless People. It holds up. It's really, really funny. By contrast, The scant few G-rated family films that Disney was still releasing under the Disney banner in that period, and they didn't release that many. Basically, The Great Mouse Detective, Flight of the Navigator, and Benji the Hunted, they all did okay at best, not great. Like, of all those Touchstone films I mentioned, the least successful of those was more successful than the most successful of those 3 kids' movies. You know, they all did okay at best. And it's not that kids and families weren't going to the movies. I mean, the biggest hit of the decade was still E.T., but Disney was losing that audience. And there was a real fear, both at the studio and in the industry at large, that Disney was basically just going to become Touchstone and just be another studio that just produced regular movies, and they'd lose the family audience forever. So Who Framed Roger Rabbit was really the big swing for the fences Hail Mary play of that early Eisner era. It was the movie where the Disney sensibility and the Touchstone sensibility were finally going to come together as one. Like I said, it had been in development under Ron Miller as a very different kind of movie. When Eisner took over, he completely revamped the project, and one of the big adamant demands he had for Roger Rabbit was, we need Spielberg. We need Spielberg aboard this thing. Back at Paramount, Eisner had worked with Spielberg on the first 2 Indiana Jones movies. Eisner was convinced that without Spielberg's magic touch, Roger Rabbit just wasn't going to work as a movie because it was just way too big, way too ambitious. He needed Spielberg's input on something like that. And Spielberg didn't really want to make it, not because he didn't like the script, he did, but because Disney at that point had a very strong reputation for treating directors as interchangeable hired hands and not really letting them have creative freedom. In fact, years earlier, Spielberg had pitched E.T. to Disney, and they turned it down because they didn't want to pay Spielberg's salary. That's literally the only reason. They loved the script. Ron Miller loved the script. The board of directors, they're like, directors are hired hands. We're not going to pay that much for Spielberg. And
I'm so shocked that Disney, who it is today, is a company that would just treat directors like hired hands. That's crazy.
I know, right? It's ridiculous. I mean, time is cyclical, weirdly, in some ways. But in order to get Spielberg aboard, and here's the real crux of where they had troubles with the sequels later, Eisner agreed to a deal that Disney had never done before or since. He gave Amblin 50-50 ownership over the Roger Rabbit IP for films and all the original characters therein. This was the first and only time Disney actually split ownership of a movie and the original characters with another studio. And to this day, Amblin still owns 50% of Roger Rabbit. If Disney wants to so much as put Jessica Rabbit on a t-shirt, it has to be approved by someone from Disney and someone from Amblin.
Okay.
You can imagine how difficult it is to develop a whole movie under such circumstances, but that didn't stop them from trying for a while. And by the way, Spielberg did end up being an invaluable resource on that movie because it was because of him that he managed to convince all the other studios in Hollywood to license their characters to Roger Rabbit, like the Looney Tunes and Droopy and Betty Boop and Woody Woodpecker. And of course, it was through Spielberg that they signed Robert Zemeckis on to direct. And this is another interesting story. Disney had also turned down Back to the Future because of the incest subplot. Now, keep in mind, every other studio in town, they turned it down partly because Zemeckis didn't have a good track record, but also because at the time, like 1981, 82, all the big teen movies were teen sex comedies, and they didn't think Back to the Future was dirty enough. They didn't think it was raunchy enough. Disney was the only studio in town that thought it was too raunchy.
That's really funny.
And they wouldn't touch it. At Spielberg's insistence and Zemeckis' insistence, they gave Zemeckis final cut over Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which ended up being a bit of a sticking point in post-production because the film did not do well in test screenings, largely because so much of the animation was unfinished and audiences didn't know what the hell they were looking at half the time. So,
I mean, that makes sense coming from Richard Williams. Richard Williams, from doing The Thief and the Cobbler, was notorious for never, ever meeting a deadline.
Right.
So that would make sense as to why.
You can't miss deadlines when you work for Michael Eisner. It's
He missed the test screening deadline, but
yeah.
So yeah, Amblin Studios was brought into the project from Michael Eisner, like you said. Now, it wasn't just Spielberg who was running the show. It was also Frank Marshall and Kathleen Kennedy who was behind this too. They were going to be in charge of basically Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And it is nice that Spielberg is that type of director and studio head who isn't dedicated to just one studio, which kind of makes sense as to why other properties would allow him to take those on.
It sounds like this is a real who's who of 80s creators.
So when they were given the script, they did give an estimated budget of $50 million for this to make. And Disney, understandably, was hesitant to greenlight it. But they did ask that, hey, if you can knock that down by $20 million, make it a $30 million movie, we'll go ahead and greenlight this movie. Amblin, not really knowing how they were going to bring it down by $20 million, they just agreed just so that they could move on with the project. But to put into context, like around this time, not only was this going to be one of the more expensive movies that Disney was going to make, especially around this change, but this was going to be the most expensive animated film feature to this date.
Right.
Disney did give Amblin a lot of creative control to make this movie, like you said, with the final cut.
And of course, Amblin's like, sure, we'll decrease the budget by $20 million. No problem. You can trust me.
They gave him a lot of creative control, and then eventually they ended up convincing like other studios like Warner Brothers Studios, Fleischer Studios, King Feature Syndicate, Felix the Cat Productions, Turner Entertainment, and Warner Pictures / Walter Lantz Productions to quote-unquote lend them their characters to appear in the film. I mean, having all of those properties, that's so many properties that they were given.
I mean, just the Looney Tunes alone would have been way too expensive for later movies. And that was probably a factor because, by the 90s, Warner Brothers was like, fuck this shit, we can make our own movies, Space Jam. Boom, Space Jam, let's do it.
With so many different entertainment companies having some sort of say in this, like I'm sure whether it was as small of a deal as make sure our characters have the exact same amount of frames as your characters.
Not just the same amount of frames, the same amount of words. Like,
oh, wow.
That was another rule. Mickey and Bugs Bunny had to have the same amount of words in the script.
That I didn't know.
Wow.
Does it come down to character count too?
Possibly, yeah. I don't.
You gave your character a longer word than ours. You got 4 syllables. We got 3.
Mickey is one character and Bugs is one character, so it's fictional characters.
It's just amazing with all these different people that this movie didn't turn out to be a complete train wreck.
Yeah.
It was insane. And talking about the budget of this movie, like, there's a documentary that came out about 10 years ago called Waking Sleeping Beauty, which I also highly recommend. That's also on Disney+. Please check it out. It was directed by Don Hahn, who's produced a bunch of Disney movies and was an associate producer on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And there's a story he tells in Waking Sleeping Beauty of how there were outposts making this movie all over the world. There was the Disney corporate headquarters in Burbank. There was Zemeckis editing the movie. There was Richard Williams doing the animation from London. There was the post-production and reshoots and shit. And at one point, late into the post-production process, Katzenberg called everyone back to Burbank, flew everyone back to Burbank to have a big meeting with the entire staff just saying, we have no more money to pour into this movie. Do you understand? We do not have a penny left to pour into this movie. You have to do it with the budget we've been given. And then everyone got back into their limos and headed back to the airport to take first class plane tickets back to London and wherever. They'd spent all this money on a meeting to tell them they had no money. Corporate culture for you. That's late stage capitalism. Whee! There's a famous story on the DVD on the special features where Charles Fleischer, the voice of Roger Rabbit, they had all the voice actors on set with them to deliver their lines from off screen, just so the chemistry would be better. But Charles Fleischer took it a step further.
Yeah.
He forced wardrobe to make him a Roger Rabbit suit. He didn't wear the face. His face was still exposed, but he still had the bunny ears and the overalls and the big rabbit suit. And he insisted on wearing that every day to get into character, even though it was just a voice role. They were shooting this at some, I think it was Elstree Studios in London. It was some big London studio. And at the same time, at the same studio, they were shooting Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. And in the commissary, Don Hahn would overhear crew members of Superman 4 going, well, how about that fucking rabbit movie? That's going to be a disaster. Did you see the rabbit? Doesn't even, you could see his face. It doesn't even look like a rabbit. Which is, it's kind of funny to think that the crew of Superman 4 was throwing shade on Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Now we know where all the budget went for this movie. It went into that damn Roger Rabbit costume.
That damn rabbit suit, I tell you.
Amazing. So going back to Jeffrey Price and Peter Seaman, they were working on the script for this. Now that they actually had an idea of which characters they were going to use, a lot of their inspiration did come from watching a lot of cartoons, which seems like the greatest job in the world, to just watch cartoons all day and write about it.
I don't know. Have you ever watched old cartoons? There's some real stinkers in there.
But they were drawing a lot of inspiration from like Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoons, especially the Tex Avery and the Bob Clampett cartoons. And they were watching a lot of old Walt Disney cartoons as well. Now, for the plot line, they did incorporate, like we mentioned before, the real-life story of Los Angeles during the 1940s when the tire and car companies bought out and dismantled the Pacific Electric Railway so that more people would be forced to drive cars rather than to take the red car. And like we mentioned before, this is from the fictional subplot based on the real story of the streetcar. Before settling on the name Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the other proposed titles were Murder in Toontown, Toons, Dead Toons Don't Pay Bills, The Toontown Trial, Trouble in Toontown, kind of like that one, and Eddie Goes to Toontown.
They really were trying to hit that Toontown name in there. It really seemed like somebody there was like, the word Toontown has to be in the title.
Yeah.
And there was also some dispute over the title Who Framed Roger Rabbit. They weren't sure whether or not to put a question mark at the end of it. Ultimately, they decided no question mark because I think someone did the research and like, a question mark in a film's title is like a curse. Like, no film with a question mark in the title has ever made money. I don't know if that's true. I haven't actually done the research on that myself, but that's what I heard.
Well, I know what I'm going to be Googling for the next hour.
I debated the same thing about the title of this podcast, and now I'm really regretting adding that question mark.
I think podcasts have different rules. It's
different curses.
Yeah. So to direct the film, they actually offered the gig to Terry Gilliam, who has been known for directing Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Jabberwocky, Time Bandits, and Brazil. He felt the task was too technically challenging and regrettably refused the offer.
That would have been really interesting.
It would have.
Well, if Gilliam had agreed to that job, he'd still be making it today. I mean, let's be honest.
That's true.
It would definitely be too technically challenging for him because he always likes to add a lot of needless technical challenges to everything he puts his mitts on. And by the way, fun fact, he was also at one point seriously in the running to direct the first Harry Potter movie.
Oh.
And apparently was really, really disappointed when that didn't come to pass. But he was always just short of getting those really big gigs. And if you've heard some of the shit he's been saying recently, good.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah.
Let's just say he and J.K. Rowling are peas in a pod nowadays. Good. But we don't have to talk about that, so...
But Spielberg eventually went with Robert Zemeckis, even though Disney was against this decision because, they denied him before, so why would you want him to come back? But this is at the time that he now has Romancing the Stone and Back to the Future under his belt, so what are you going to do about it? They did find the right director for the job, and Amblin also then got rid of Daryl Kitters and was replaced with Richard Williams to direct the animation for the film. Blending live action and animation, this is not anything new as far as cinema, and especially with Disney. We mentioned before what they had done before. There was also The Song of the South, Three Caballeros. They did that as well. Disney first started experimenting, though, with this technique back in the 1920s with a short film series called Alice Comedies. There was also Max Fletcher's Out of the Inkwell. They also messed with that, too. What made Roger Rabbit unique, and the reason why Steven Spielberg sought out Richard Williams, was his ability to blend animation with the real world and made it seem like these 2D characters were living in a 3D world. Williams had done this before with a Fanta commercial which featured Disney characters.
Fanta, my friend Fanta, orange flavor and lots more.
It almost looks like it was taken out of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the way that they were able to blend in live action and these characters. But this was done in, I think, 84, I believe is when this commercial came out. I can see why Disney would come to Richard Williams for this.
We did these three things that no one had ever done before. One was we used a moving camera. because to make life easier for the animators insisted the camera was locked off, static. So I said to Bob, I've already done these commercials violating the rules, and I know you can use a moving camera.
And then knowing from The Thief and the Cobbler, for Richard Williams, he saw this as an opportunity to really get his name out there and to eventually use this as like a launching point to get his movie actually funded.
But yeah, it is kind of sad what ended up happening there, because of course Jeffrey Katzenberg, being a petty asshole, put Aladdin into production, and then he did the same thing at DreamWorks to a bunch of Disney movies, and everyone was surprised.
Yep. So now it came down to the casting, and the list of actors for Eddie Valiant, that was actually pretty long. They wanted first Harrison Ford, but he was too expensive. Chevy Chase was not interested. Bill Murray was considered, but he was working on other films at the time. Eddie Murphy supposedly and regrettably turned down the role because he misunderstood the concept of cartoon characters and humans coexisting in the same universe.
This would have been before Eddie Murphy was basically a cartoon character in his movies.
Yes.
I mean, kinda. I still don't know if it would have been the wisest idea to cast a funny person, you know, acting against the Toons, because the Toons are supposed to be the funny ones. I could definitely see Harrison Ford playing Eddie Valiant in a normal movie, because one of the great things about Bob Hoskins is that he was a mime before he was an actor. He went to mime school, and he was able to, when you see his performance in Roger Rabbit, you absolutely believe that the Toons are there, that he's playing off them perfectly, and he was able to nail that performance. I don't know if Harrison Ford would have given that much of a fuck.
Yeah. Even though he's been in other special effects stuff, I think he openly criticized some stuff in Star Wars and not being thrilled about being a part of a project like that. I don't see him having a good time on this set.
No.
Maybe Bill Murray could have nailed the delicate balance of between gaining laughs through being the straight man, because that's kind of what he was doing in Ghostbusters to a certain extent too, of just reacting to the crazy stuff as like a normal person would. So maybe he could have played Eddie Valiant, but again, I don't think he would have been as great as at imagining the Toons in the same universe as Bob Hoskins was. And if you don't believe me, watch Space Jam.
Yes.
He was the best part of Space Jam. That's not saying much. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Was there anybody else on that list of people who were considered?
Oh man, there were so many. Robin Williams, Robert Redford, Jack Nicholson.
Oh, Robert Redford. I would be interested in a Robert Redford Roger Rabbit.
Sylvester Stallone, Wallace Shaw, Ed Harris, Charles Grodin, and Don Lane. They were all considered before eventually casting Bob Hoskins.
Well, Stallone is weird, because why would you cast a cartoon character?
Part of the reason why Bob Hoskins works is because he is that perfect blend of somebody who can be serious and the straight man, but can still like have that wonderment and believability to act off of these cartoons. But I would be really interested in seeing a Robert Redford or an Ed Harris version of this movie. I think both of those choices would have been really, really fascinating.
And, you know, Bob Hoskins was not a big star at the time. Certainly not to Roger Rabbit's intended audience. Like, yeah, he'd been in the movie Mona Lisa, I think the lead in that. But otherwise, he was just kind of a character actor playing these small roles in movies like Pink Floyd's The Wall and Terry Gilliam's Brazil.
Was Hook already out at this point?
No, Hook was a few years later. So, and then, of course, Super Mario Brothers after that.
Mario Brothers.
Bob Hoskins.
Wow. That man is really a chameleon. So then we have Judge Doom. Now, Christopher Lloyd was a great fit for the film, especially since he did work with Zemeckis and Spielberg previously for Back to the Future. He very much played the character similar to the one that he portrayed in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, where he played Krug, the Klingon commander. You can actually like watch both of those characters side by side and you're just like, that's the same person, even though it's so weird seeing Christopher Lloyd in Klingon makeup. But as far as their performance goes, it's like almost identical.
Folks, prisoners have beam coordinates.
You should take the Vulcan too.
No,
But why?
because you wish it.
I wasn't working for a tune.
I was working for Arcane Maroon.
Yes, we talked to Mr. Maroon. He told us the rabbit became quite agitated when you showed him the pictures. The rabbit said one way or another, he and his wife are going to be happy.
Now, before Christopher Lloyd, and I thought this was really interesting, Tim Curry actually auditioned, but the producers thought that he was too terrifying.
Really?
Except for the one on the end. That's already taken. Sorry.
I'm not afraid of you.
Oh, that is interesting. I would really want to see Tim Curry play that role.
He would spend the last third of the movie just going in detail how they framed Roger Rabbit and running through the Acme warehouse, detailing how the murderer had killed Marvin Acme, shit, but anyway. Run down the hole!
And then they would go through the alternative endings for the film, the
alternative endings. And then he'd dress in drag for some reason. I don't know.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, the actor that was considered not scary enough was John Cleese.
I could see that. I could see John Cleese sinking his teeth in a role in Judge Doom and not being scary in the least. So.
Yep. And then the other list of actors considered were Christopher Lee.
Oh, Christopher Lee would have nailed it. Oh, man.
Oh, yeah.
Peter O'Toole, F. Murray Abraham, Rodney McDowell, Eddie Dezzine, and Sting.
Sting!
It's interesting to me that there are a ton of British actors on this list, and they decided not to go British for the final casting.
Well, they filmed the movie in London.
Yeah.
And of course, Bob Hoskins is British, so... And Zemeckis even said on the commentary, it's like, every British actor can do a flawless American accent, and there's a ton of American expatriate actors living and working in England, so there's really no reason to ever shoot a movie in America. It's... But Sting as Judge Doom, that would have been... I'm trying to do an Insta parody, like every tune you kill... I don't know. It doesn't matter.
Now, when it came down to the design of Roger Rabbit, Richard Williams did describe the character as, and quote, Tex Avery's cashew nut-shaped head, the swatch of red hair, like Droopy's, Goofy's overalls, Porky Pig's bow tie, Mickey Mouse's gloves, and Bugs Bunny like cheeks and ears. So, I mean, this kind of embodies all of the properties that they had obtained and just kind of mashed it all into this one, like, Cronenberg-type character.
And as I understand it, obviously Roger's fur is white, and he made his overalls red, and I think his bow tie blue, so it would be like the American flag. Like, it would remind people of the American flag, and at least American audiences would instantly like it because he's red, white, and blue.
And I think they also just did an excellent job with making a design that feels like this is a cartoon character that's been around for a while. And I've definitely seen Roger Rabbit cartoons. Like, there's just something so timeless about the design.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned that Richard Williams, he openly disdained the bureaucracy of Disney, and he would only work in his studio in England, which was fortunate because, I mean, the Roger Rabbit was filmed in England. In post-production, took nearly 14 months to complete all the animation for this. And during the post-production, the budget of $30 million then went up to $40 million, which made Michael Eisner consider shutting down the movie. Now, fortunately, Jeffrey Katzenberg, he actually stepped in and convinced Eisner to let the film continue. And $10 million later, which made the budget now $50 million, the film was complete. But there was an article that was in the New York Times that came out in 1991 that actually estimated the cost of this film really ballooned up to around $70 million.
Yeah, I was going to say $50 million is what they admit to spending. With productions like this that balloon out of control, they always spend way more than they admit.
And luckily for Disney, this film paid off. And it grossed over $11 million the opening weekend in just the U.S. Overall, the film made nearly $330 million worldwide and is the 20th highest grossing film of all time.
Oh, wow. I assume that's adjusted for inflation?
I think so, yeah. But still very impressive, yeah.
Yeah.
So with all the success, clearly they had to make a sequel. And Spielberg was actually working on a sequel in 1989 and was working on a script with Robert Zemeckis and an inspiring writer, Jeffrey Abrams, also known as J.J. Abrams.
Whoa,
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, before we do that, I do want to hear about these Roger Rabbit shorts because I am totally unaware of these.
All three of the shorts that actually came out are also on Disney+. So the first few minutes of Who Framed Roger Rabbit is, of course, this Roger Rabbit Baby Herman short called Something's Cookin'. And after Roger Rabbit did so well, Disney's like, hey, we got this character with a built-in mythology that he stars in these short cartoons. Let's just make some more shorts and let's put him in front of features in order to entice people to go to our movies more often. And they made 3 of them in total. First one was Tummy Trouble, which was released in 1989 with Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Hey, let go of the cotton, you swab!
Then in 1990, there was Roller Coaster Rabbit, which, by the way, was directed by a young Rob Minkoff, who would later go on to direct The Lion King. And that played with Dick Tracy. And in fact, that was one of the first huge sticking points between Disney and Spielberg. And this is where we start getting into territory where maybe it's not such a great idea for 2 studios to own 50% of the same character, because Spielberg really wanted Roller Coaster Rabbit to play in front of Arachnophobia, which was a movie he had produced that Disney was going to release under the Hollywood Pictures banner in summer 1990. But Eisner eventually overruled him and said, no, we're putting it in front of Dick Tracy, the Warren Beatty Dick Tracy movie. And Spielberg was so incensed at that he did a dick move of his own, and he canceled the 3rd Roger Rabbit short that was in production at the time. It was going to be called Hair in My Soup. I think the premise was it's Roger in some, fancy restaurant kitchen and hilarity ensues. And not to be seen. The short was canceled, and Disney was fully intending to release it the following year in 1991 with The Rocketeer. 3 more Roger Rabbit shorts were also canceled that were in development at the time: Clean and Oppressed, Beach Blanket Bay, and Bronco Bustin' Bunny. And it eventually took 3 years to finally release the 3rd and final Roger Rabbit short, Trail Mix-Up.
Rabbit season opens today!
Oh boy! It looks like it's just you and me, kid. A couple of rugged pioneers. Let me tell you how to make a fire.
In 1993, which was released with another Spielberg-Disney co-production, a little scene drama that very few people have heard of called A Far Off Place. I've seen it. When it was in theaters, I was a kid. I would have been excited to see a new Roger Rabbit short. I didn't even know about it until years later. I didn't know that there was a Roger Rabbit short playing with this, boring drama about kids in Africa.
You definitely gave me a major flashback there, because I didn't see Roger Rabbit until I was an adult. It was just one of those movies that I didn't grow up with as a kid. That was or as I always thought, was my introduction to Roger Rabbit. But when you mentioned that there was a short in front of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, all of a sudden I just had a major flashback to having that VHS as a kid, which I haven't seen that movie in years, but I am just now realizing, oh wait, I actually did get introduced to Roger Rabbit through one of those shorts. I have seen one of those shorts. Just hearing the word Tummy Trouble all of a sudden just burst that back into my brain.
Huh. And Tummy Trouble was the only one of those shorts that actually also got released on VHS with its accompanying movie. The other 2 didn't get released on VHS until I think 95 they released a VHS tape with all 3 shorts on it. So that's what happened with the shorts. There were also plans for a Roger Rabbit simulator ride that would have gone into Disney MGM Studios in Walt Disney World called Toontown Trolley, and which would have essentially been Star Tours squared. It was a simulator ride where you'd see moving footage out the windows to the left and right as well as in front of you. And it was all going to sync up, and the idea was that Roger Rabbit was driving the Toontown trolley all over Toontown and careening wildly all over the place. It would have been fun, but it ended up never being built, although eventually Roger Rabbit's cartoon Spin was built at Disneyland in Anaheim. The rift between studios also led to such projects as the TV show Bonkers.
Bonkers.
Now, Bonkers, of course, had a very similar premise to Roger Rabbit. It took place in Toontown. They even called it Toontown. And it was this weird toon named Bonkers who was teamed up with this no-nonsense, detective. Not Eddie Valiant, but very similar to Eddie Valiant in certain respects. Now, the creators of Bonkers have denied up and down to this day that it was originally developed as a Roger Rabbit series, but then changed at the last minute, because Spielberg didn't want to be involved. But that's always how Spielberg saw it. He always saw it as, oh, so here's how they're trying to do Roger Rabbit without me? Well, fuck you guys. And that's why on Animaniacs, which premiered the same season as Bonkers, Animaniacs made fun of Bonkers every chance they could get. Like, there was a Slappy Squirrel cartoon where...
no wonder you like that Bonkers show. That junk's rotting out your brain there.
Wow. Well, I would love to hear, what are some of the stories, Dan, with the creation of a sequel?
So Abrams was then dropped, and so was his draft, but they did bring in Nat Maldwin to write a new draft of the script.
Do we know anything about this J.J. Abrams draft?
Not really. He talked about it very briefly on the Nerdist podcast when he was a guest, but he didn't reveal any details. He just said, yeah, I was involved for a couple of meetings, but it never got past the outline stage. So who knows if it ever would have been anything, or if it ever even really was anything. So
yeah, or if his career panned out in any way.
Yeah. So. No way of knowing.
With Maudlin, prior to this, he primarily wrote for Night Court, so I thought was odd. So Maudlin, he wrote a draft called Roger Rabbit, the Toon Platoon. Now, this script you can actually find online, and there are so many people that do table reads of this specific script.
Yep.
Yeah. The story was set in 1941, and it went to 1943. Prior to the first film, which took place in 1947.
I actually read this script in preparation for this podcast. Did either of you read the script?
I listened to one of the table reads, which I kind of wish I didn't because there were so many interruptions and so many distractions.
Oh, man.
I really despise...
We wouldn't know anything about that.
Yeah.
I am completely oblivious to this.
Well, should we go over the plot?
I have a really quick summary plot, and then I'll have you dive in and go even further. So, Roger Rabbit has been raised by humans, and during his birthday celebration, which I don't think they say how old he actually is.
They say he's 18.
He's 18. Okay. His foster parents tell him that he's actually a toon, and that his real parents are somewhere out west. So, with the help of his human friend, Richie Davenport, they set out on an adventure to find his parents. During their adventure, they met Roger's future wife, Jessica Krupnik, who is a struggling actress. Richie and Roger are also drafted into the army at the same time that Jessica is kidnapped by a bunch of Nazis and is forced to star in a bunch of pro-Nazi propaganda films.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. Roger and Richie, and with the help of a bunch of other toons, thus the Toon Platoon, they go into the Nazi-occupied Europe and go in and save Jessica. She is saved. They come home. There's a big parade, and Roger finally somehow meets his parents, and then Bugs Bunny shows up at the end and says, "Ain't I a stinker?"
Well, you left out the most important part, because throughout the whole script, Roger is specifically searching for his mother. He really wants to find his mother. And at the end, he's welcomed home as a hero. He gives a big speech in front of the Chinese theater. Eventually, the crowd disperses and he sees this lady rabbit, this older lady rabbit, and is Mom, and they hug. And then Roger says, "But wait, what about my dad?" Camera pans over to Bugs Bunny, munching on a carrot, saying, "Nah, ain't I a stinker?" And iris out. So it's rather optimistic, really, because the whole gag of the final punchline of the movie depended on them being able to get the Warner Brothers characters again, which I don't know if Warner Brothers would have been down for that. That might have been one of the reasons this wasn't made.
I'm really curious. I think about how much cartoons were a part of wartime propaganda in World War II. Yeah. I think it's interesting that Jessica Rabbit, or whatever her last name would be at this point.
Jessica Krupnik.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Jessica Krupnik is a part of Nazi propaganda, and they're bringing that as a part of the story. Do they do anything with the Toon Platoon in American, wartime propaganda?
Not a lot of propaganda. There is a scene in the screenplay where you see a newsreel showing how they're using the toons in battle, because the idea is the U.S. Army recruits all the toons because they think, well, Toons can't be killed, so the Nazis can throw everything they got at these guys and they'll just keep on going.
Oh man, ain't that a metaphor for our platoons of people of color in World War II?
Yeah, except in this case, Toons actually can't be killed, so it was...
Yep.
They definitely had that metaphor going for it, but it was easier to swallow. But the problem is, of course, when the Toons actually arrive on the battlefield, they're more inclined to goof off and entertain than to attack. So most of them end up being reassigned to work at a supply base.
I guess I'm really just waiting for this to be like a beat for beat at the same as Captain America: The First Avenger.
There's some similar parts to it. I will say that the script is a little bit lopsided because the first act has almost nothing to do with war whatsoever. It's just Roger and Richie arriving in Hollywood, and Richie's trying to make it as an actor, and they end up meeting Jessica and her human friend Wendy, who ends up being Richie's love interest. They all get an apartment together, and Richie keeps trying to, get acting roles, and then Roger ends up screwing up Richie's big break and impressing the studio head completely by accident, just by stumbling onto a set and, getting electrocuted and bouncing all over the place. And the studio exec there is like, that kid, he's got the talent, and signing him to a career and all that. And at the end of Act 1, as they said in Futurama, war were declared.
What's that? War were declared.
It's December 7th, 1941, and Jessica immediately gets kidnapped because she's working at a radio station doing voices for various shows, and the head of the radio station turns out to be a Nazi spy who kidnaps her and takes her back to Germany, where she's forced to do Nazi radio broadcasts under the name Axis Annie. Roger and Richie both enlist in the army. They end up being part of the titular Toon platoon. Two of the other Toons in their platoon are Swifty Turtle and Blackie the Cat. Now, Swifty Turtle is basically Cecil Turtle from the Looney Tunes, the one who, fucking Mitch McConnell talks like, that guy.
Yeah.
And Blackie was a character from a Tex Avery short where his whole gimmick is that you whistle for him, and if he crosses the bad guy's path, something heavy falls on the bad guy's head, because it's like, he's a black cat, he's bad luck. There are a lot of really funny gags involving him crossing Nazis' paths, and like a grand piano will land on their heads and shit. It's like, it's Inglorious Toons, basically. Now, one of the big set pieces in the movie is when we get the origin story of Jessica's look. Up to the third act of the movie, she's dressed very modestly and conservatively, and she's wearing glasses the whole time, and her hair's done up. It's like the whole pre-transformation of She's All That or something.
Mm-hmm.
There's a point where she has to seduce a Nazi officer in the third act in order to get some keys away from him, because otherwise he's going to use the keys to launch a missile that's going to blow up a Malta conference where FDR, Churchill, and Stalin all are. And in order to get these keys away from him, she has to get his pants off. And so they swipe the infamous red dress and, the high heels and such. And she's like, I don't think this is going to work, and she tells her human friend, you're the pretty one, you should be doing this. And she has this transformation sequence into the Jessica Rabbit we all know and lust after. You could tell reading it, like, how it was going to work, and it's a pretty effective sequence, I gotta say. And in the final climactic sequence, like I said, the Nazis do end up actually launching that missile meant to blow up the Malta conference. Richie, whose character arc we discover is that he was an Air Force pilot, or at least his dad was, and he tried to go into the Air Force, but he was really scared of heights, and he just couldn't do it. And he has to get over that fear of heights in order to fly a Toon plane named Pee-wee, who's also afraid of flying, up to the missile and, stop it somehow in midair. Ultimately, it leads to this whole cartoon action sequence where Roger ends up riding the missile, running all up and down it, and ultimately it explodes in midair behind the Malta conference in this huge fireworks show that spells out "Eat at Joe's," and it's that kind of humor, definitely. So.
Man, there's such a strange way this is playing with tone, and I guess does take after Who Framed Roger Rabbit in that it's mixing dark film noir with this cartoon animation.
Yeah, these cartoon tropes with film noir tropes, and here it's mixing cartoon tropes with war movie tropes.
Yeah, and it's so weird to hear about it without seeing it, because there's so many times where my brain is trying to figure out, would this have worked? Would this have actually been good? And it's so impossible to tell, because I feel like if somebody tried to explain to me Who Framed Roger Rabbit without me actually watching it, I would be thinking those same questions.
So much of this would have come down to the execution. And ultimately, a big reason why it's so unsettling, in one's mind at least, is that these are the fucking Nazis we're dealing with.
Yeah, there's a bit of a disconnect here, but ultimately... So Maudlin, he did change the name of the script from Toon Platoon to Who Discovered Roger Rabbit to better fit in with the first title. And then the script did remain in development hell. And after Spielberg had finished Schindler's List in 1993, he decided to remove himself from the project because he did not want to deal with satirizing Nazis.
That makes a lot of sense.
Schindler's List was what convinced him, like, I don't want to depict Nazis as cartoon villains ever again.
Which is so interesting because, like, Spielberg in the 80s with Indiana Jones is Nazis are cartoon characters. It's really interesting how he kind of had that personal mind switch that I think also led into a cultural switch in the way that we view World War II and the atrocities of the Nazis.
And of course, it's why when he finally made Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he made the bad guys Soviet Russians, and that's not nearly as fun somehow.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I meant Drop Dead Comrade.
That wasn't just the end of it all, but the studio was still persistent on going through with the sequel. And in 1997, that's when Eisner commissioned Sherry Stoner and Diana Oliver, who had worked on Tiny Toons Adventures, Animaniacs, and Casper, to write a draft. In their story, they kept Roger's search for his mother, but they replaced the World War II plot with his rise to stardom on Broadway and in Hollywood. The producers at Disney were impressed, and they prompted to hire Alan Menken to write 5 songs for the film. Prior to that, he had written music for Little Shop of Horrors, Beauty and the Beast, Newsies, Aladdin, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, and a lot more. Basically, whenever Disney needs songs, they go to him.
And one of the songs that he wrote for Who Discovered Roger Rabbit, obviously the movie never got made, but one of the songs was a song that Jessica sings at one point. It's a ballad called This Only Happens in the Movies, which was later recorded by Broadway actress Kerry Butler on her 2008 solo album, Faith, Trust, and Pixie Dust. So if you want to hear how that song would have sounded,
just listen right now.
For this only happens in the movies.
As for the animation direction, Disney turned to Eric Goldberg instead of Williams, because he's probably off doing his thing. Although Goldberg had worked with Williams before, like on Raggedy Ann and Andy, the musical adventure, Ziggy's Gift, and The Thief and the Cobbler, he would later on work on films like Looney Tunes Back in Action, and he's actually currently the animation director for Space Jam: A New Legacy.
Yep. And probably his biggest claim to fame, even to this day, is that he was the supervising animator of the genie in Aladdin.
Yes, he was.
Oh, interesting.
And was very much responsible just visually for the manic energy and for the genie's overall look, which was very much inspired by Al Hirschfeld. He also directed 2 segments in Fantasia 2000, Rhapsody in Blue, and I forget what music it was based on, but the segment with the flamingos and the yo-yo. That whole thing. Those were both Eric Goldberg. And we should probably talk about the test sequence they made for this version of the movie. In 1998, Disney commissioned a brief 10-second test scene of Roger singing and dancing Gotta Dance on the desk of what looks like a talent agent or something. It's clearly made using a blend of 2D and CGI techniques. The Disney executives didn't really like how it looked, and you can kind of see why. Like, it doesn't quite look like the same thing. It's not quite there.
So what do you think, big fella?
They seem to be kind of overdoing it on the shading, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's getting a little into the uncanny valley where, they're trying to make it look more like Roger belongs in this 3-dimensional universe when really he looked more realistic when he just looked 2D.
Yeah.
You don't have to overdo it like that.
So, yeah, Spielberg is out, and also at this time he started developing DreamWorks, but that doesn't mean that Amblin actually left the project. They're actually still a part of this and still kind of pushing for the sequel to happen. And yeah, they did do the screen test with the CGI, and it seemed odd. With the sequel that was promising, the one that was written by Sherry Stoner and Diana Oliver. They actually estimated how much this would cost, and this would actually be $100 million to make, in which Eisner looked at that price and was like, no, I don't want anything to do with this.
Specifically, he didn't think there'd be enough interest in a sequel to a decade-old movie to justify that cost, which is weird because it feels like today all Hollywood releases is sequels to decades-old movies.
Yeah, that's
what
true.
are you going to do? Now, I heard about this other Roger Rabbit sequel idea. Now, this was not listed on the Wikipedia page for Roger Rabbit sequels. The only place I've ever heard about this, it was when Jim Hill talked about it on a podcast once. So take it with a grain of salt, because Jim's a really great guy in the Disney fandom community, but he has a bit of a shoddy track record for being right about these sorts of things. So take this with a grain of salt, but if this was a real project at one point, then I'm so sorry it didn't get made, because it sounds amazing. So this one would have been a proper sequel as opposed to a prequel like the others. It would have taken place in 1954, so 7 years after the first movie. The premise is studios are increasingly shutting down animation departments like they really were in the mid-50s, forcing Toons to find work in television or sell their shares of Toontown. Roger is having no luck in TV, so Eddie Valiant gives him a job as his new detective partner, and they open an agency together. And their first client is none other than Mr. Walt Disney, who hires them specifically to investigate some mysterious goings-on at a certain construction site in Orange County. If you know what I'm talking about. Now, the really interesting thing with this script is it would have tied into the mythos of Mickey's Toontown. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember when Mickey's Toontown first opened and when it was heavily advertised everywhere. When it was opened in 1993, the backstory, which they sold relentlessly in all the promotion of it, was that Mickey's Toontown was the place where all the Toons lived for the entirety that Disneyland has existed, even since before Disneyland existed, and it's where the Toons all lived when they weren't entertaining guests at the park. But now, in 1993, for the very first time, the guests were invited there too. They even tried releasing like a single to tie called Rockin' Toontown by Craig and Company, where the first verse basically summarizes what I just said. You know, there was a special hideaway where only Toons could stay, but now you're invited too. You know, shit like that. So this script would have tied into that mythos, and the conceit of the movie is, with so many Toons selling off their shares of Toontown and Toontown slowly eroding as a result, Walt was going to make sure that all of his Toons had a home of their own forever, and he built that home under the guise of building a theme park. And in one scene, Eddie Valiant would have asked Walt, "So are you ever going to open Mickey's Toontown up to the public?" And Walt would have replied, "Maybe someday," which would have tied in really well if they had released the movie at the same time as the land. Another interesting fact about this, they were planning to use the Euro Disneyland construction site at the time as the Disneyland construction site, because they were going to shoot in Europe anyway, like they'd done with the first movie.
This is definitely the mythologized version of Walt Disney, and
absolutely,
has very little in common with the real Walt Disney.
Well, what's interesting about that is that they were two very different people, the mythologized person and the real man, but not
to say that there wasn't good things about the real Walt Disney.
There was more overlap than you might think. He was more like that guy you saw on TV. Now, he was much shorter with the people who worked with him. Like, he was a lot less jovial with them all the time, because, you know, he had to put on a show for the cameras. In particular, famously, like, songwriters who worked for him or animators, you know, when they'd show him a new song or a new shot they'd finished, he would look at it and say, "Yeah, that'll work." And that was the most praise he would ever give them. He would never say, "Wow, that's amazing, that's great." He would just say, "Yeah, that'll work." I remember when Tom Hanks had been cast as Walt Disney in Saving Mr. Banks, and someone in an interview asked, "So is this going to be just a warts and all portrayal of Walt Disney?" And Tom just says, he wasn't really a very warty guy, to be honest. I mean, the worst you could really say about him is that he named names before the House Un-American Activities Committee. That he was...
Wasn't he, like, historically pretty anti-union and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah. He was extremely, extremely anti-union and very anti-communist. He basically thought they were one and the same. that union rabble-rousers were all just communists trying to infiltrate capitalism. He definitely swallowed the Kool-Aid of capitalism.
But that, of course, doesn't mean that he wasn't a creative person and a friendly person or,
Absolutely. People have taken that to extremes like, oh, he was an anti-Semite or he was a racist or, there's no proof that he was more racist or anti-Semitic than the typical Christian white dude of his age.
It would be really interesting to see a story like Roger Rabbit, but with a Walt Disney character, the aspects of Walt Disney, like the upset at Union side. Like, it would be really interesting to see a story of Toons where there is a Walt Disney figure who is the villain of the story.
Well, to a point, that was kind of R.K. Maroon in the first movie.
How much do you know about show business, Mr. Valiant?
Only there's no business like it.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Or he's a cartoon magnate who's just kind of an asshole. The movie would have had gags tying into the opening of Disneyland. Like, if you've ever seen the opening day telecast from 1955 or my riff of it, several years ago, me and my good friends Charlie Callahan and David Gansel did an MST3K style riff of Disneyland's opening day telecast from 1955.
Oh, wow.
It was a lot of fun to make. Go check it out on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Tony Goldmark, if you're interested. But, like, if you've seen that footage, there's one point where Mickey and Minnie run out to wave to the crowd, and it's these horrific-looking Mickey and Minnie costumes that don't look a thing like them, and it just looks so unsettling to watch them. And in the movie, they would have shown that footage, but then cut to them running backstage and pulling off their fake heads, and it's the real Toon Mickey and Minnie underneath. It's
that's really cool.
That's the kind of gags they would have done in this movie. So
that's really cool. I like that a lot.
So, and it turns out they're hiding out for some reason. It would have tied into the opening. It would have been fun. But anyway.
It also sounds like this story probably would not have gotten the rights to other cartoons because...
Definitely not.
Yeah, because it's so heavy on Disney.
In fact, I can imagine, because at the time... Spielberg was really heavily involved with Universal Studios. Like, they had made, Back to the Future, the ride, and the E.T. adventure, which Spielberg was actually in. Spielberg, hosts the pre-show of the E.T. adventure.
Do they already have the Jaws shark on the tram tour?
Oh, yeah. They had that since the late 70s. But yeah, Spielberg probably at that point was so heavily involved with Universal that would have been a bit of a conflict of interest to devote too much attention to a movie about their competition. So, what are you going to do? Again, I don't know if there's any truth to the... All I know about is that I heard Jim Hill talk about it on a podcast once, so maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but it's fun to talk about regardless.
Do you happen to remember what that podcast was? If anybody wants to go search that out for themselves.
I think it was Disney Dish podcast with Len Testa, but I couldn't tell you what episode. Because the problem with Jim Hill is that he keeps digressing into these other stories. So if you remember him saying something in one podcast, there's basically no way of tracing which podcast it was without listening to all of them. So, and who has that kind of time?
Do you have any other stories on your notes there, Dan?
Yeah, so there's a lot of rumors and speculations about potential sequels. So, in 2009, the original writers, Jeffrey Price and Peter Seaman, they told MTV News that they were working on a new sequel. And in 2010, Zemeckis stated that when the sequel gets made, it would be created like the first film. Live action mixed with animation, CGI would use to help with lighting and props, but all the animated characters would be hand-drawn. Also, Bob Hoskins at the time expressed interest in reprising his role as Eddie Valiant. After Hoskins unfortunately passed away due to complications with Parkinson's disease, Zemeckis stated during an interview at a Flight premiere that the sequel would still happen even with Hoskins out of the picture. In February of 2013, Gary Wolfe, who is the author of Who Centered Roger Rabbit, announced that he and Eric Von Wooddyke were working on a buddy comedy which would star Mickey Mouse and Roger Rabbit called The Stooge, which was supposed to be kind of an homage to the 1952 film with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis under the same name. That story would take place 5 years prior to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and this would also explain how he met his wife Jessica. There's been no word on that progress. But the latest news that we got was from during 2016, Robert Zemeckis was currently promoting Allied, and he said that the sequel, quote, moves the story of Robert and Jessica Rabbit into the next few years of the period film, moving on from film noir to the world of the 1950s. And this would feature Eddie Valiant in ghost form, I guess. Yeah.
I don't know what he meant by that. I mean, does he mean like Peter Cushing or in Rogue One or something? Like,
I want to imagine that they would kind of bring him on, kind of like with Superman Returns, and they brought in Marlon Brando, where they were taking footage from the first films and like echoed him in like here and there. I don't know.
Or like they did with Carrie Fisher in Rise of Skywalker, where she's just there to say, I won't allow it, or yes, or no. And they have all the other characters say,
details.
You give all the exposition that,
this is your generic mission and you must do it well. Yeah.
I also want to go back to the 2009 news because at first there was a lot of concern for that project because that was the year Zemeckis released A Christmas Carol, so he was firmly, drowning in the mocap Kool-Aid by then, and people were concerned, is it going to be proper animation? And at first Zemeckis said Roger and Jessica and all the tunes would still be 2D animation, but the backgrounds would be like CGI mocap.
Okay.
But the following year, he backtracked on that. The following year, he made another appearance where he said it would be shot just like the original movie, but again, with some CGI help. And the reason he stopped making mocap films is because the studios basically stopped greenlighting them because Mars Needs Moms flopped, which Zemeckis did not direct that one, but he produced it, and it was developed at his mocap company, Image Movers Digital, I believe. He was, at the time, developing a fourth mocap movie that he would have directed, and I'm almost sad that this got canceled after Mars Needs Moms flopped because this would not have been good. It would have been a fascinating train wreck. A mocap remake of Yellow Submarine.
Whoa, that is very strange.
Again, would not have been good. As Doc Brown says in Back to the Future 3, it'll be a spectacular wreck.
Great Scott.
Too bad nobody will be around to see it.
I saw Yellow Submarine for the first time like a year or two ago. I cannot imagine that being a Zemeckis CG. I don't even know. That's a nightmare.
A couple of years ago, someone leaked some of the concept art for it and some of the maquettes of what the characters would have looked like. They are fucking hideous.
Wow.
I mean, look this up if you really want to not sleep for a week.
It really sounds to me like this is one of those projects that people are just going to keep saying they're working on a sequel of forever, like Gladiator 2 or Avatar 2, that they're never actually going to make.
Recently, particularly while Zemeckis was promoting Welcome to Marwen back in 2018, he's said various times they've got a script for a potential Roger Rabbit reboot that's just kind of sitting gathering dust at Disney, and Disney's not really interested in making it,
I have his quote here, yeah. The current corporate Disney culture has no interest in Roger Rabbit, and they certainly don't like Jessica at all.
Well, I guess not surprising, but it's like, wow, what a difference a few decades made.
Yeah.
When Disney MGM Studios first opened in 1989, a year after Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Roger was just all over that park. And you can still see some remnants of it, of just set dressing, of like, there's one corner of the park, I believe, where you see Eddie Valiant's office and stuff, like, because it's supposed to resemble 1940s LA. And so it was perfect theming. But yeah, he also said in 2018, I don't know where it fits in their universe. There's no princess in it, so I don't know where that would be.
Yeah.
Throwing a little bit of shade. I feel like a Roger Rabbit sequel would have a better shot at getting made if Mary Poppins Returns had done better. As groundbreaking as it was for animation, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is still a live-action film, and Disney nowadays seems pretty much interested only in remaking and sequelizing animated films. And whenever they sequelize a decades-old live-action film, like with Tron Legacy or Mary Poppins Returns, it seems like the box office is always okay at best, no matter how much of a classic it is. The only exception to this, really, is Star Wars The Force Awakens. But Star Wars is really in a class of its own, so that almost doesn't count.
I know Zemeckis is working on live-action Pinocchio for Disney.
Yeah. Maybe if that does really well, Disney will...
What? You mean the one with Jonathan Taylor Thomas wasn't good enough?
Drew Carey as Geppetto or we riot.
At the very least, we're going to get lots more interview statements and rumor mill stuff about Roger Rabbit 2, because I'm sure the press tour is going to be full of that.
Definitely. You know, in the last 3 years alone, Disney has given us, you know, whether we want them or not, given us sequels to Star Wars, The Incredibles, Winnie the Pooh, Wreck-It Ralph, Mary Poppins, Toy Story, and Frozen, as well as remakes of Dumbo, Aladdin, The Lion King, Lady and the Tramp, and Mulan. It's starting to feel like they're running out of franchises to reboot and or sequelize, so if they continue along this path, I figure just by law of averages, they have to get to Roger Rabbit eventually. I mean, they are doing a sequel to Honey, I Shrunk the Kids after all these years. It's going to be called Shrunk. Josh Gad is involved, and he's playing the grown-up son of Wayne Szalinski.
Whoa, really?
And Rick Moranis is coming back for it.
Whoa!
He's coming out of retirement.
I thought he was going to come back for the sequel for Spaceballs.
Spaceballs 3, The Search for Spaceballs 2?
Yeah, there was talk of that happening. Mel Brooks nowadays is like 90, so he's probably too old to direct it. But, I mean, Shrunk is being made for Disney Plus, so maybe they'll consider it. Just the coup of getting Rick Moranis. Like, he was offered a cameo in the Ghostbusters 2016 remake, and he turned it down, which... Considering how small those cameos in that movie were, like where Annie Potts literally all she had to do was turn around and say, not even Ghostbusters, what do you want? Just what do you want? It's like, and he wouldn't even do that. And also he was offered a cameo in the first Ant-Man movie.
No.
Originally in the scene where Scott Lang first gets the suit and is first trying it out and he's careening all over the building, they were going to do a shot where he fell into an apartment where Rick Moranis was eating Cheerios.
Whoa.
He was going to land in the bowl and they were going to do that whole thing, but Rick Moranis turned it down, so they got a Garrett Morris cameo instead. So,
that's so interesting.
Swapping SCTV for SNL. So
now, do you know why he keeps on refusing? I know that before it was...
I think he just doesn't like it anymore. Although he was just recently in that Mint Mobile commercial with Ryan Reynolds. So, I mean, I'm ready for a Moranisance if it ever happens, you know. But, you know, maybe if Shrunk does really well on Disney Plus, they might consider bringing back Roger Rabbit. I mean, shit, if Space Jam can get a sequel, anything's possible. So,
do we have any other notes on this story, Dan, before we start bringing this episode to a close?
I mean, going through all of this, I realized, like, to this day, Robert Zemeckis is still interested in the sequel. There is a script that is written for it, but Disney doesn't seem interested in making it. Plus, they own the rights to it, so they can't exactly shop it around to other studios. And even if they could go to other studios to do this, they wouldn't get permission from Disney to get their characters. So most likely they will not approve of that. So I feel like Disney is really the one that's kind of blocking the way. And I don't see them ever releasing those rights completely to Amblin because they've incorporated it so much into their parks and they're probably still making money off of even the likeness of the characters, especially Jessica Rabbit.
I feel like with this movie and any potential sequel, I think that like most sequels, it's just doomed to fail and doomed to not be nearly as interesting as the original. I feel like there is this perfect juxtaposition in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. When I first started doing podcasting, before I did Thank You Internet, me and some friends tried doing a show that lasted like 20 episodes before we stopped doing it. Nobody ever listened to it, but it was called This Is Not a Film, where we talk about like the meanings in movies. And one of the episodes we covered was Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And one of the big takeaways for me in talking about that movie is that Who Framed Roger Rabbit is this perfect juxtaposition of the dark film noir genre and the very bright cartoon genre. And these two genres that both came about in the same era of early movie making, and both are kind of separate from reality in very different ways. And there's something about that juxtaposition that really, really, really works and makes it such a special and memorable film.
I mean, the scene at the end where Eddie's driving into Toontown and it's like this dark, scary, ominous tunnel that leads to a curtain that pulls back and all these tunes going, smile, darn ya, smile. It's like that's the crux of that juxtaposition right there.
I think in all of the different pitches we heard, the war juxtaposition, I think, could have worked. But again, I think because you're dealing with Nazis, I think it would have been not right. It would have felt too weird. The Broadway storyline with the screen test of Gotta Dance that we saw a bit of, that's something where you don't have that same dark and light juxtaposition. It seems like it's combining cartoons with that Singin' in the Rain style early film musical. And that, I feel like it wouldn't have been as memorable as well. I think that actually, of all the pitches we heard, it seems to me like the most likely to be good. It still would not have had that same magic that the original had. Like, I think the only way that you can capture any of that same magic is if you did another film noir story, but at that point, you're just doing a less good version of something we already saw.
Speaking of other podcasts, because I did a podcast, I'm not sure if it's going to be released or not, but it was one called Hollywood Movie Factory, that's what we called it, where we would come up with fake sequels for films and we would break down a treatment as to how it would work.
It's kind of like the fictional version of this podcast where you guys would be the ones coming up with the pitches.
Yeah, and we came up with a sequel where we were following Eddie Valiant instead of Roger Rabbit. So instead of it being about Toontown, we thought, what if Eddie Valiant could kind of go around into different universes of different characters that aren't human. So the sequel that we proposed was that he would move to New York City and more specifically Sesame Street and have to deal with the Sesame Street gang. But we had to...
So it was Happy Time Murders, basically.
Yeah. It would be like that. But what we wanted to incorporate, because we had to put in a real life scandal as well. So we incorporated the garbage men strike that happened in the 70s and try to find ways to incorporate that. And we had it so that we made it seem like Oscar the Grouch. It made it seem like he was the murderer at first, but in the end, he was just some guy who's just really grouchy. And because of the strike, trash is everywhere and he couldn't find his home anymore.
I mean, Zemeckis says that Price and Seaman have written a great sequel script. I'd love to read that script that they've written that's currently sitting at Disney. If they leak that script, I'd love to see it. I feel like Zemeckis at this point is too old for it to be possible for him to really do a Roger Rabbit sequel justice, because, I mean, when was the last really good film he made?
Yeah.
I mean, Flight was pretty good, I guess. But, you know, he...
You didn't like Welcome to Marwin?
I tried to turn Welcome to Marwin into a meme on Twitter for a while, where I would just work Welcome to Marwin into everything and just say, you know, let's give everybody a big Marwin welcome. Welcome to Marwin turned down box office success. Box office success is not worthy of a Marwin welcome. You know, like it was a cult or something. I don't know. You know, Zemeckis is getting up there. Maybe if you gave that script to a really young director who kind of gets the youthful energy of Who Framed Roger Rabbit a bit more, but I mean, who would do the animation? I guess Eric Goldberg. I mean, that's another part of the problem, is that no one's really doing 2D animation anymore. I mean, I guess this might be a way to really bring it back full force if Disney suddenly decided they really wanted to. But again, I'm not sure why they would, because CG animation seems to be working pretty well for them, financially at least. So
I say give the project to Darren Aronofsky and make it really dark.
There you go. That's...
All right. I think that's all I had to say about this movie. Any other final thoughts, anybody?
Don't watch Cool World. Watch Roger Rabbit instead. It's much better.
I rewatched Roger Rabbit when it came to Disney Plus for the first time in forever. That's one of those movies that kind of always surprises me how well it holds up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. And Tony, thank you so much for bringing us this story and this idea and for being on the show with us.
My pleasure. pleasure. If you're interested in following my stuff, obviously Escape from Walt Disney is my podcast. New episodes every Wednesday. If you pledge to my Patreon, patreon.com/Tony Goldmark, you get new episodes a day early on Tuesdays instead of Wednesdays. And you can follow me on Twitter at Tony Goldmark. You can follow my podcast on Twitter at EFVD Podcast. And you can check out my stuff on Pipe Dream Podcasts, of course. And yeah, that's my stuff.
Of course, your YouTube channel.
Oh, of course, my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Tony Goldmark, where you can see that riff I was talking about earlier of the Disneyland opening day telecast, which was a lot of fun to make. And also, I got 3 seasons of Some Jerk with a Camera. I got a bunch of State of the Parks and One Movie Later episodes. And my most recent video on my YouTube channel is a State of the Parks editorial vlog about the history and future of Splash Mountain. And my most recent episode of the podcast, Escape from Walt Disney, is on the 2003 remake of Freaky Friday, starring Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan, with special guest Kyle Calgren of Brows Held High, so check that out.
I highly recommend that Splash Mountain video. That was excellent.
Thank you so much. I do mention the movie Splash in that one as well, but...
Yeah, I know. As soon as you said it here, that's immediately where my brain went to. Yeah, and thank you everybody again for listening. You can find episodes of this podcast by going to pipedreampodcast.com, where you can also find our other shows like The Weird Alphabet, which is putting out our last episode for a little bit this coming Monday as this show is released. And you can also find my podcast with Michael, Come On Fahugwa Pods, where we and my wife Alexa talk about every Homestar Runner cartoon. And that is a ton of fun over there. You can also send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com, and find us on Twitter and Instagram, HDTNGM.
That's on Twitter, and then on Instagram, it's How Did This Not Get Made?
Thank you.
It's very confusing, I know.
That's going to wrap us up, and thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Beep, 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 beep. Piss off, Lou.